Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a former Air Force mechanic named Elena Ward uncovers a downed Apache helicopter, long lost to time, and a secret powerful enough to destroy lives. What she finds inside will test her courage, her faith, and her past. If you believe the truth is worth fighting for, like this video, subscribe, and stay with us until the end. The morning mist hung thick over Silverback Ridge, wrapping the trees in pale ribbons of cloud. Elena Ward stepped onto her porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in her hand, and listened to the silence. The world around her always began this way, still and soft, the chirp of wrens and the creak of branches marking the forest's slow awakening. But today it was different. The quiet felt heavier, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Elena took a slow sip and frowned. She had lived on this ridge for 8 years. The air today felt wrong, colder, dimmer. The air was colder, the light dimmer. Her breath formed small clouds as she looked toward the tree line. "You feel it too, don't you, boy?" she murmured. Cooper, the old golden retriever lying beside her chair, raised his head and gave a low, uncertain whine. She scratched behind his ear, her fingers rough with old scars, the kind that told stories she didn't like to retell. Once she had been a flight mechanic for the U.S. Air Force, one of the best, they used to say. Her USAF detachment had been seconded to a joint Army task force at Kandahar, keeping Apache's mission ready. She could fix anything that could fly. But war had a way of grounding people more than machines. After Afghanistan, after the crash that took her crew, she had left everything behind: the base, the noise, the guilt. Out here she could live quietly, away from the ghosts that still came when she closed her eyes. She lifted her gaze to the horizon, to where the ridge dipped into a sea of fog. A faint ringing pulsed in her left ear, the same tinnitus that had followed her since the explosion. It was the sound that had replaced silence in her life. But this morning something cut through it, a tremor so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Then she heard it again, a low thump, rhythmic, distant, a sound she could never mistake. Rotor blades. "That's impossible," she whispered. There hadn't been military flights in this zone for decades. She strained to listen. The sound came once more and then stopped, swallowed by the fog. The forest fell back into stillness, but her heart didn't. She set her mug down, suddenly aware of how fast she was breathing. Cooper stood, ears perked, nose pointing toward the valley. The old instincts inside her stirred, the same ones that used to send her running toward danger, wrench in hand, ready to keep a machine alive while men trusted it with their lives. She shook her head. "It's just thunder," she said, but thunder had no rhythm. She walked back into the cabin, her boots leaving damp marks on the worn wooden floor. Inside, everything was as she had left it. The framed photograph of her unit on the shelf, the folded flag from the day she left service, the faded patch with her name Ward stitched above the heart. She touched the frame, her thumb brushing over a familiar face. "Tom," she whispered. "Captain Thomas Blake. He had been more than her commanding officer. He'd been her friend, and he'd vanished 15 years ago along with his Apache helicopter. The official report said lost in hostile territory, but she'd never believed it. Not when the coordinates didn't match, not when the flight logs were sealed. The government was good at burying things. She had learned that lesson well. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the earthy scent of rain, and something else metallic, faintly acrid, like oil burning on hot steel. Her pulse quickened. She walked to the window and saw the fog crawling closer, swallowing the tree line, turning the world to silver. She should have felt safe in her solitude. Instead, she felt watched. "Come on, Coop," she said softly. The dog wagged his tail, sensing her unease. She opened the door and stepped into the mist. Each step down the dirt path seemed louder than the last. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cried, once sharp and lonely. The sound cut through the fog and then faded. Elena stopped and closed her eyes. She could almost hear it again, the faint pulse of rotor blades far away, as if echoing from the past. She felt it in her chest, a vibration more than a sound. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe after all these years, the mountain was finally giving something back. She turned to Cooper and managed a thin smile. "Let's take a walk," she said. He barked once, soft and eager, and together they disappeared into the pale breath of the forest. The fog had thinned by mid-morning, leaving streaks of sunlight slanting through the trees like pale blades. Elena's boots sank softly into the damp soil as she followed the narrow trail, the leather straps of her old canvas backpacks biting gently into her shoulders. Cooper trotted ahead, nose low to the ground, tail swinging in quiet rhythm. It had been years since she'd walked this far into the woods. The silence was still there, but now it seemed to move with her breathing, listening almost alive. She adjusted her jacket and whispered to the dog, "Easy boy. We'll turn back soon." But even as she said it, something in her kept walking forward. The path curved around a fallen oak, its trunk blanketed in moss the color of emerald ash. Cooper stopped, suddenly muscles tensing beneath his coat. His ears perked, and he let out a soft, uncertain bark. "What is it?" Elena asked, stepping closer. The air changed. It carried a faint metallic scent beneath the damp earth. She followed his gaze and saw it just a glint. At first, something sharp cutting through the green. She pushed through the ferns, her hand brushing away the vines until her fingers touched cold metal. Beneath the growth lay the smooth edge of something impossibly familiar. Her breath caught as her fingers clawed through moss and dirt, uncovering what she already knew. The shape grew clearer, the curved armor of a fuselage, the broken rotor blade half buried in soil, the faded ghost of a number stenciled in military font. An AH-64 Apache. Her Apache. She stumbled back, heart hammering against her ribs. The paint had peeled away, and vines coiled over the cockpit like veins reclaiming flesh. The forest had swallowed it whole, but not completely. She could still make out the insignia on the tail, a worn emblem, a circle enclosing a single wing. Her old unit, the 122nd Maintenance Division. For a moment, time folded in on itself. She was 29 again, standing on the scorching tarmac of Kandahar, the air thick with jet fuel and dust, Thomas Blake's voice cutting through the roar of engines. "She'll fly, Ward. You always make sure she flies." That had been the last thing he said to her. She blinked hard, pulling herself back to the present. The forest stood still, the world hushed as if paying respect to what it had kept hidden. She stepped closer to the cockpit, her reflection faint in the cracked glass. Inside, the pilot's seat remained upright, the harness still fastened. Through the grime, she could see the pale remains of a flight suit fabric turned to dust around brittle bone. Her throat tightened. The name patch on the chest was barely legible, but she leaned in, brushing it with trembling fingers. The letters came slowly into focus. Captain T. Blake. She slid a brittle, folded note from the jacket's chest pocket and tucked it into her own. For a long time, she couldn't move. Cooper whimpered behind her, as if sensing the weight of what she'd found. The years collapsed like paper. 15 years of searching, of unanswered reports, of silence from command. He hadn't vanished overseas. He'd been here buried in the woods she'd chosen to call home. Oh, Tom. Her voice cracked, thin and unsteady. She pressed her palm to the shattered glass. You were here all along. A single gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the scent of rust and pine. The rotor blades creaked faintly, shifting under the weight of vines. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but tears blurred her vision. Every rule she'd learned as a soldier told her to leave the site, untouched, to call it in. But the soldier in her was long gone. What was left was a woman who had spent too many nights wondering why he never came back. She circled the wreck slowly, her boots sinking in the soft earth. There were no rescue markings, no recovery tags, nothing to indicate anyone had ever found it. No record, no trace, just silence. She crouched beside the cockpit and brushed away a layer of dirt at the base of the seat. Something metallic glimmered underneath. She froze, hand hovering, uncertain if she should continue. "What did you leave behind, Tom?" she whispered. The wind answered with a low sigh through the trees. Cooper barked once, sharp and nervous. She turned to him, sensing his unease. The forest seemed to lean closer, its shadows darker, its quiet deeper. She reached for the edge of the floor panel and began to clear the debris, her pulse quickening. Whatever lay beneath that seat had been hidden for a reason, and now after 15 years, it was calling to be seen. The moment Cooper's paw scraped against the floor, a hollow clang answered from beneath the dirt. The sound was faint, but unmistakable metal against metal. Elena froze, heart pounding, as the dog began to dig at the spot again, sending small clumps of damp earth scattering over the cockpit. "Wait," she murmured, reaching to steady him. The floor beneath the pilot's seat wasn't just corroded steel. There was something hidden underneath. She brushed away more soil with the sleeve of her jacket, revealing the faint outline of a panel sealed tight, almost invisible against the rust. Her fingers traced the edge. This panel wasn't standard Apache design. She found a small latch, almost worn smooth, and hesitated before pulling. The hinge groaned softly as it gave way. Beneath the panel lay a shallow compartment lined with black insulation foam. Inside, half buried in dirt, was a small rectangular case-gray military issue, the kind used for encrypted drives or intelligence storage. The casing was intact, though time had worn away most of its paint. Only one line remained legible, etched deeply into the surface: classified, compartmented, unauthorized recovery prohibited. The words sent a chill through her. She had seen similar markings before, but never this warning. Usually they said property of U.S. Army or return to command. This was different. It was an instruction for silence. She lifted the case carefully, the weight solid in her hands. "What did you do, Tom?" she whispered, half afraid of the answer. The forest seemed to hold its breath with her. She looked around instinctively, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing but mist and stillness. Her training told her to stop to report it, but the soldier in her was long gone. The woman left behind had lost too much to trust anyone with ghosts like this. She slid the case into her backpack, zipped it shut, and wiped the mud from her hands. Her breath quickened. Cooper whined softly, his fur speckled with dirt and raindrops that had started to fall through the broken canopy above. "We're leaving," she said quietly. The first drops of rain fell heavier, tapping against the metal hull like a measured drumbeat. As she stepped away from the wreck, she turned once more to the cockpit, to the silent figure that had once been Captain Thomas Blake. She stood there a moment, rain and sweat mingling on her face. "I'll find out," she whispered. "Whatever this is, I'll find it." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth and rusted steel. By the time she reached the trail again, the sky had darkened to a dull gray. The storm came suddenly, as it often did in the ridge sheets of water, spilling through the trees, drenching her clothes, soaking the straps of her pack until they clung to her shoulders. Cooper kept close beside her head, lowered ears back. The path home was a blur of mud and shadows. Each flash of lightning lit the forest in harsh white, turning the trunks into skeletal figures. The rain drowned out every other sound, and still she could not shake the feeling of being followed. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. The same instinct that had kept her alive overseas now whispered again, warning her that she was no longer alone in these woods. When she reached the clearing near her cabin, the storm was in full force. The wind bent the pines, and thunder rolled through the valley like distant artillery. She climbed the porch steps, her clothes dripping, her breath trembling with fatigue and something close to fear. Inside the cabin smelled of pine wood and old coffee. She set the soaked pack on the table and pulled the case out. It looked smaller now, more dangerous in its simplicity. The latch was sealed with a strip of corroded brass engraved with a serial number. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the cold bite of the metal. For a long time she just stood there, listening to the rain against the roof. It wasn't the steady comfort she usually found in storms. This one felt heavier, deliberate, as though the sky itself was warning her to stop. But she couldn't. Not now. She placed the case beside her old laptop, wiped the moisture from her palms, and sat down. Cooper lay at her feet, restless, his eyes never leaving the window. Elena stared at the object, her reflection faint in its dull sheen. There was a reason it had been buried, a reason no one was supposed to find it. Outside, lightning flashed again, revealing the forest beyond the window, tall, unmoving, watching. The power flickered once, then steadied. The inverter caught, and the battery bank took the load, smoothing the lights. Elena took a slow breath, her pulse loud in her ears. Whatever was locked inside that drive was the kind of truth people had died to hide. She reached for the latch, her fingers hovering just above the cold metal, the rain drumming harder against the glass, as if urging her not to. The rain had not stopped by the time dusk folded into night. It drummed against the roof in uneven rhythms, filling the cabin with a sound that might have been comforting, if not for the weight of what lay on the table. The gray case gleamed faintly in the lamplight, droplets of water still sliding off its edges. Elena sat before it, her old military laptop humming weakly as it booted up. It was a relic from another life, its keys worn smooth, its stickers faded to ghosts. She hesitated. Her reflection caught on the black screen, then inserted the drive's connector. A dormant beacon pinged the moment the interface hand shook. She killed the link in a panic, but the ping was already gone. The laptop flickered to life, rows of folders labeled in sharp military code. Each file name began with a string of numbers and an operation tag she hadn't seen in years. Operation Ravenfall Hollow Point Echo Run. All marked Top Secret Classified. Her breath caught as she scrolled. Most of the files were locked, layers of encryption that even her old clearance would never bypass. She tried to open one anyway. The system froze for a moment, then displayed an error message, access denied. She leaned back, rubbing her temples. It was enough just to see them. These were mission reports, maintenance logs, flight data operations that had been erased from the network years ago. She knew because she had searched for them once, trying to make sense of the crash that killed her team. "Why would you hide this here?" "Tom," she murmured, staring at the lines of classified text. "What did you find?" The storm pressed harder against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks like distant voices. The power flickered once, twice, before steadying again. Cooper lifted his head from the floor, his eyes tracking every movement she made. "It's okay," she said softly, though the words were more for herself than for him. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the folder names again. Each one felt like a memory clawing its way out of the grave places she had worked, units she had serviced, pilots she once knew. There was no doubt now these files belonged to her division, the same one Captain Blake had served under. The same one that had covered up the crash. Her throat tightened. "You were right," she whispered to the photograph on the wall, the one of her old crew smiling beside the rotor blades of a new Apache. "They buried you, and they buried the truth with you." Every instinct she'd once relied on screamed for her to stop, to turn it in, to let someone else handle it. But there was no one left to trust. She knew how cover-ups worked. She had signed too many maintenance reports stamped confidential, watched too many colleagues disappear after asking too many questions. She looked down at her hands, at the faint scars along her knuckles. Souvenirs from the years she'd spent keeping engines alive. Machines, unlike people, did not lie. They broke, and you fixed them, or they stayed broken. The truth should have worked the same way. Outside, the wind shifted suddenly, sweeping across the ridge with a low, moaning sound that made the window panes tremble. Cooper raised his head, ears pricked. Elena frowned, glancing towards the door. "It's just the wind," she said, but the dog was already on his feet, growling low. The sound vibrated through the small cabin, deep and uncertain. She crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The fog had thickened, again silver and dense, rolling between the trees like smoke. At first she saw nothing, just the ghostly outlines of pines swaying in the wind. Then a small light appeared, hovering above the tree line. It was faint at first, then steadier, moving slowly through the mist. Her breath hitched. For a moment she thought it might be a lantern, or some camper caught in the storm. But the way it moved, too smooth, too precise, told her otherwise. The light tilted, paused, and then shifted direction in a deliberate arc. She recognized that pattern instantly, A drone, military grade. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't supposed to be here. No one flew recon drones in restricted civilian zones like this. And yet, there it was, hovering, scanning, searching. "They're looking," she whispered. The word felt heavy in her mouth. The light lingered for a few seconds more before fading into the fog as if it had never been there. Cooper barked once, short and sharp. Elena stepped back from the window, drawing the curtains shut. The cabin felt smaller now, the air too close. Somewhere deep in her chest, the old instincts came alive again. The same ones that once saved her on the field when danger crept in unseen. She turned off the lamp, letting darkness settle. Outside, the storm roared on, but inside, the silence was louder. She sat at the table again, staring at the drive, the screen still glowing faintly. "Why you, Tom?" she asked under her breath. "Why hide it with me?" The question hung in the air unanswered, swallowed by the rhythm of the rain and the wind that now sounded almost like the echo of rotors far away, turning somewhere in the night. An engine throb rolled up the gravel outside, then braked hard at her porch. The wind had barely settled when the first shot shattered the window. The glass exploded inward, scattering across the floor like rain made of knives. Instinct overrode thought. Elena dropped, grabbing Cooper by the collar as another bullet tore through the doorframe. Gunfire cracked outside, boots thudding against the porch. Someone shouted a man's voice, firm, professional, "Take the drive!" The words sliced through the chaos, and her heart seized. She rolled behind the table, pulling Cooper close, breath ragged. Her mind raced, the old training snapping back into place like an old reflex that had never really left. 1 second to locate, 3 to react. She could hear at least 3 of them, maybe 4, spread around the porch, moving in formation. Not amateurs, not thieves. Whoever they were, they knew exactly what they were here for. Another bullet tore through the wall, splintering the wood inches above her head. Cooper barked, low and furious. She whispered down, pressing her hand against his back until he stilled. The room filled with smoke from shattered lamp oil, a bitter scent that stung her eyes. The laptop screen still glowed faintly on the table, the classified folders frozen mid-scroll. Her gaze darted toward it, then to the old rug beneath her feet. Her father's voice echoed in memory. "If you ever need to disappear, there's a way under the floorboards." She hadn't thought about it in years. Her hand groped for the corner of the rug, heart hammering against her ribs. The bullet stopped for half a breath, replaced by the crunch of boots on gravel outside. Someone kicked the door open, shouting, "Go, go!" The hinges snapped. She yanked the rug back, revealing a small steel handle built into the floor. Her fingers shook as she pulled it up, revealing darkness below. The old bootleg tunnel. Dust and cold air rose from its depths, carrying the scent of earth and oil. "Cooper," she whispered. The dog crawled toward the opening without hesitation, his tail brushing her arm as he slipped into the narrow space. Another burst of gunfire ripped through the wall. She ducked, slid into the tunnel after him, and pulled the hatch closed just as a bullet cracked through the edge of the table above. The noise was deafening in the confined space. Dirt showered her face as she struggled to breathe. The tunnel was barely wide enough to crawl through. Her knees hit cold soil hands, scraping slick beams. The only sound was her pulse thudding in her ears and the muffled chaos above. Then came the smell smoke. The heat spread fast, seeping through the boards. Her home was burning. She kept crawling, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Cooper moved ahead, his claws scraping softly against the ground, guiding her through the dark. Behind them, the cabin groaned as the fire consumed it, the sound of collapsing wood echoing through the tunnel like thunder. She pressed her lips together to keep from crying out. Each breath tasted of dirt and ash. Her eyes stung as tears mixed with sweat sliding down her cheeks. Memories flashed in fragments. The morning coffee on the porch, the framed photo on the shelf, the quiet peace she had built piece by piece. Gone now, all of it. "Keep moving," she told herself, her voice barely audible. "You can mourn later." She crawled faster, ignoring the ache in her arms. Smoke drifted down through cracks in the ceiling, and she coughed, her throat raw. The air was thick, heavy, but she could see a faint shimmer ahead, a dim sliver of light filtering through roots and stone. Hope, or maybe just an exit. She reached it and pushed at the old wooden hatch, but it resisted, swollen from years of rain and neglect. She shoved again, harder, until it gave way with a dull crack. Cold air rushed in, cool and sharp, against her burning lungs. She gasped, pulling herself out into the open night. The rain had returned, soft and steady, hissing as it met the embers that drifted down from the ridge behind her. Cooper emerged beside her, covered in dirt, panting heavily. Elena knelt beside him, her chest heaving, eyes fixed on the orange glow rising from where her cabin had stood. Flames licked the sky, turning the rain to steam. She could hear the faint echo of voices still shouting, though them were distant now, swallowed by the storm. She clutched Cooper's collar, tears streaking her soot-covered face. The fire's reflection danced in her eyes. Everything she owned, every memory she had tried to protect, dissolving into smoke. "It's gone," she whispered, barely audible over the wind. All of it. The forest around her stood silent, save for the hiss of rain and the faraway crackle of flames. Somewhere in that silence, something shifted inside her. Not fear this time, but something colder, steadier. The past had found her, and now there was no going back. She rose slowly, brushing mud from her hands, her breath shivering in the cold air. Cooper stood beside her, waiting. She didn't look behind her again as she stepped into the darkness of the trees, the distant firelight fading behind them, swallowed by the storm. Dawn broke slow and gray over the mountains, light crawling across the ridges like a hesitant hand. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the forest slick and breathing its branches dripping quietly into the stillness. Elena sat beneath a leaning pine on the northern slope, her back against the trunk, her body trembling from exhaustion. The world smelled of wet earth and smoke, faint remnants of what had burned behind her. Cooper lay beside her, chest rising and falling steadily, his fur damp and streaked with mud. She reached out and brushed a bit of ash from his head. "You did good, boy," she murmured, her voice hoarse. The sun tried to pierce through the clouds, but could not yet. She waited until her hand stopped shaking before pulling her backpack closer. The canvas was still wet, the zippers stiff with dirt. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was the small note she had found in Blake's flight jacket pocket at the crash site. She had almost forgotten it amid the chaos. Carefully, she unfolded the page. The paper was brittle and yellowed, creased down the middle. The ink faded, but still legible. 2 words in his handwriting stared back at her widow's hollow backup stash. She traced the letters with her thumb, her heart tightening at the sight of the familiar loops of his script. His handwriting had always been precise, neat like everything else he did. The name tugged at an old memory, Widow's Hollow. She whispered it aloud, testing the sound of it against the silence. It stirred something faint, an echo of a conversation long buried. It had been during her last year of service, back when she and Blake had shared maintenance duty for an Apache stationed at Fort Owens. They had been waiting out a sandstorm in the hangar, both too tired to speak much, when he'd mentioned a place back home. A mine, he'd said. Old, abandoned. "My father used to take me there when I was a kid. Said it was where men used to dig for gold, but found only dust and ghosts. You could shout your name into the shaft and hear it come back hours later." She remembered laughing at the image, then asking why he liked it if it scared him. Because he'd said it keeps secrets, the kind the world isn't ready to hear. The memory hit harder now, sitting in the chill dawn. Widow's Hollow wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was close. She pulled out an old map, edges frayed from years of folding. Her father had given it to her when she first moved here, saying every mountain had its memory. She spread it over her knees and traced the northern trails with a shaking finger. The name wasn't printed anywhere, most old mines had long been scrubbed from official charts, but she knew the terrain well enough to guess. 20 miles north, maybe more, across 3 ridges, and one deep valley where the river cut through stone. It wouldn't be easy. "So that's where you hid it," she whispered to the paper, imagining Blake's voice in the silence. "And now you want me to find it." The thought made her chest ache. He had known her well enough to predict this, to know that she wouldn't be able to walk away, that she'd chase the truth, even if it destroyed the fragile life she'd built. She folded the note and tucked it safely into the breast pocket of her jacket. Cooper lifted his head and whined softly as if sensing her thoughts. She gave him a tired smile. "We've got a long walk ahead of us." She stood joint stiff and looked down the slope towards the valley below. Mist still pooled there, thick and white, drifting like the ghosts of old storms. Somewhere beyond that fog lay the mine waiting. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and rain, and beneath it, the faint metallic tang of old iron. She slung the backpack over her shoulder, the weight of the hard drive pressing against her back. The thought of what might still be hidden there, a second cache more data, maybe evidence of whatever Blake had discovered, set her nerves on edge. But beneath the fear was something sharper, stronger purpose. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from the past. She was walking into it. She took one last look at the valley behind her. Smoke still curled faintly from the ridge where her cabin had stood. It looked small now, distant, already swallowed by the mountains. Everything she owned had burned, but she felt lighter, for it stripped down to what mattered. The truth. She turned north. The trail ahead was rough, almost overgrown, but she followed it without hesitation, her boots sinking into the damp soil, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Cooper trotted beside her, his gait slow but steady. The forest watched them pass, the sound of dripping leaves echoing like a clock ticking somewhere deep in the hills. As she climbed, she kept replaying Blake's voice in her mind, the warmth of it, the way he'd always found calm in the middle of chaos. She wondered if he had known what would happen to him if he'd hidden the evidence, knowing it would cost him his life. And if so, had he written that note for her all those years ago, trusting that someday she'd be the one to follow it? The question lingered soft but insistent as the light finally broke over the ridge, casting long shadows across the trail ahead. The forest changed when the night took over. By day it was a place of refuge, full of light, filtering through the leaves and the steady rhythm of wind in the branches. By night it was a maze of shadows and whispers. Elena moved through it carefully, her breath steady, each step measured. The trail had disappeared hours ago, swallowed by undergrowth and fog, but she knew how to travel without leaving tracks. She had learned long ago that silence could be both weapon and shield. Cooper walked close at her side, his movements quiet, his eyes catching faint glints of starlight whenever he glanced back at her. For 2 nights they moved north, sleeping by day beneath rock and pine. The map she carried was barely a guide anymore, more memory than paper. The ridge ahead curved toward the direction of Widow's Hollow, though she was still at least 2 days away if she stayed off the main trails. She had to, because the first night had shown her something she could not unsee. Around midnight, just after she'd made camp in a shallow ravine, she had heard the hum of engines, not the deep roar of trucks or military convoys, but the softer, steadier sound of ATVs, the kind used by private security units. Their headlights sliced through the mist like slow-moving eyes. She had pressed herself flat against the cold ground, holding Cooper close as the beams swept across the tree line above. There were at least 4 vehicles moving in formation. The men driving them wore dark gear, but no insignia, their faces hidden behind visors. They didn't shout or talk. They moved with the discipline of soldiers, but they weren't military. She could tell by the way they scanned the ground, not searching, but hunting. When they passed, she had waited a long time before moving again. Now every night, since she had heard them, sometimes close, sometimes far, always searching. Tonight, the air felt heavier, carrying the scent of rain and fuel. She crouched beneath a fallen log, peering down the slope. The valley below was alive with movement. A flicker of lights moved through the fog, 3, maybe 5 flashlights sweeping in deliberate arcs. She could hear faint voices carried by the wind, distorted, but close enough to make her chest tighten. Cooper let out a low growl. and she pressed her hand against his neck. "Stay," she whispered. Her pulse drummed in her ears as she reached into her pack and pulled out the small receiver she'd taken from an abandoned ranger post earlier that day. It was old, but still picked up shortwave signals. She tuned it slowly, adjusting the dial until the static cleared. Voices crackled through, faint but distinct. "Sector 5 green copy, negative visual on Alpha." Then a pause, followed by a voice that made her blood run cold, calm, controlled male. "Command to all units. Objective Alpha is Ward. Code Black, no carry." She froze. The voice continued. "Asset must not reach Widow's Hollow. Confirm Black Alpha." The radio hissed and went silent. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She stared at the receiver, the words echoing in her mind. No survivors. Not capture, not containment. Erasure. They weren't after the drive anymore. They were after her. She turned off the receiver and sat still for a long moment, listening to the sound of the wind in the trees. The forest had gone quiet, again unnaturally, so as if even the night creatures understood what hunted within it. Cooper shifted closer, pressing against her leg, waiting for a command. "It's all right," she whispered, though her voice shook. "We'll stay ahead of them." But she knew how this game worked. Once someone became a liability to the kind of people Blake had uncovered, there were no second chances. She thought of the files on that drive, of the names and operations marked top secret. How many others had vanished because they tried to tell the truth? How many like her were buried in silence? The question gnawed at her as she stood and shouldered her pack again. Every rustle, every crack of a branch made her flinch, though she kept moving. Her boots sank softly into the mud, and the forest swallowed the sound. They climbed higher, following a narrow ridge that offered no cover but distance. The moonlight flickered through the branches, glinting off the wet bark. Her breath came in shallow bursts, fogging in the cold air. Somewhere below, an engine started again, and a beam of light swept the hillside. She pressed herself flat against the ground, heart hammering. The light passed over them, then moved on, vanishing into the trees. She waited until she could no longer hear the engines before moving again. The fatigue settled deep in her bones, but adrenaline kept her alert. She knew she couldn't risk calling anyone for help. Even if she could reach law enforcement, who would believe her? The same people hunting her were likely the ones who had buried Blake's disappearance. There was no one left to trust. She had learned that lesson years ago when she walked away from the service, when she realized loyalty often came with a price measured in silence. As dawn began to rise faintly behind the ridge, painting the mist in shades of gray, she stopped to rest beneath a rock overhang. The forest below was still peaceful, in a way that almost felt cruel. Cooper lay beside her, eyes half closed but alert to every sound. She ran a hand over his back and whispered, "They won't stop until they find us." The dog's ears flicked toward her voice as if in agreement. She looked out at the valley stretching towards the horizon. Somewhere out there, buried in the mountain, was the truth Blake had died protecting. And now it seemed she would have to survive long enough to bring it to light. The path to Widow's Hollow was steeper than she remembered. From the maps, a maze of cliffs and thorns that seemed determined to turn her back. Elena's legs burned with every step, her boots caked in mud, the air thinning as the slope climbed towards the northern ridge. For 3 nights, she and Cooper had traveled without stopping for long, always listening, always watching for lights that might sweep through the forest behind them. Now, as the dawn bled into gray, she stood before the mouth of the old mine. It yawned open beneath the mountain like something ancient, and wounded a scar in the earth long forgotten. Cold air drifted out from its depths, smelling faintly of iron and ash. The wooden beams around the entrance were rotted, half collapsed, and the rusted warning sign, "Danger Mine Closed since 1972, hung by a single nail. She tightened the straps of her pack and whispered to Cooper, "Stay close." The dog gave a soft whine, but followed her inside. The light from her flashlight sliced through the dark in a thin white column, revealing dust suspended in the air like falling snow. Every sound echoed the crunch of her boots, the the steady drip of water somewhere deep within the faint rustle of unseen creatures retreating into cracks. The tunnel widened into a chamber braced by timbers blackened with age. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. She could see her breath in the beam of light. Blake, she whispered into the stillness, as if his name might answer her. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. After several minutes of searching, her light caught something out of place beneath a pile of rusted tools. She knelt, brushed away the dust, and revealed the edge of a steel trunk, its surface dull but intact. A lock with a 3-digit code hung from the latch. She reached out, tracing the numbers with her fingers. "Backup stash," she murmured, remembering the words on the note. She turned the dial, slowly trying a few combinations that meant something to her Blake's service number, the date of their last deployment. Nothing worked. Then she tried one more 122, the designation of their old maintenance unit. The lock clicked open. Her breath caught as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded plastic, were stacks of folders, the edges yellowed but still legible. At the very top lay a file marked Aegis Tactical Solutions, confidential contracts. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it free. Each page was stamped with approval signatures, and one name appeared repeatedly at the bottom: Evelyn Red, CEO. The documents detailed shipment routes, coded transactions, and lists of serial numbers. They weren't maintenance reports or field operations, they were weapons manifests. Weapons shipped under government contracts to destinations that didn't officially exist. She read the line twice before it sank in. Aegis Tactical had been selling American arms to foreign buyers, enemies of the state, and masking it under defense budgets. Her stomach turned. It was treason hidden beneath bureaucracy. Cooper shifted uneasily beside her, his nails clicking against the rock. She took a slow breath and reached deeper into the trunk. Beneath the papers was a small, foil-wrapped bundle. She peeled back the layers and found a satellite phone, its battery still sealed, and beside it a small black memory card taped to a handwritten note. The spare lithium pack had been vacuum sealed, voltage held. The writing was unmistakable Blake's. For proof. Her pulse quickened. She took out her laptop, connected the card, and waited. For a long moment the screen stayed black. Then the image flickered to life. The video was grainy, but clear enough. A woman sat at a glass desk in an office marked by wealth and precision modern art. On the wall, an American flag framed behind her. The nameplate in front of her read Evelyn Red, CEO, Aegis Tactical Solutions. Elena leaned closer, her throat dry. Red was speaking into the camera, her tone calm, practiced. "Our shipment will leave the Dubai port within 48 hours, she said. "Payment has been confirmed. I trust your associates will ensure discretion." The camera panned slightly, revealing two men across the table, their faces blurred, but their accents unmistakably foreign. One slid a briefcase toward her, opened it, and inside lay rows of cash stacks upon stacks. Red smiled faintly, her composure flawless. "Pleasure doing business," she said. The footage cut abruptly to black. Elena sat frozen, the glow of the screen washing over her pale face. Her hands shook as she reached to pause the file. She didn't need to see more. It was enough to damn an entire company to expose a network of corruption that reached far beyond one CEO. This was why Blake had disappeared. This was what he had died trying to reveal. "You found it," she whispered, voice breaking. "You really found it, Tom." The words echoed softly through the tunnel, swallowed by the stone. She looked down at the files spread across the ground, the cold metal of the trunk biting into her knees. Everything here, the documents, the footage, the signatures, was proof. Proof strong enough to bring down anyone involved if she could get it out. But she knew what it meant now. The people hunting her weren't just covering up a lost helicopter, they were erasing a trail of treason. Cooper whined again, restless, and she turned off the laptop, plunging the chamber back into near darkness. Her flashlight beam trembled slightly as she stood. Outside, the wind had begun to rise, carrying a low, distant rumble that could have been thunder or something else. She reached for the satellite phone thumb hovering over the power switch and listened. The mine groaned faintly, old timbers settling. It sounded almost like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. The mine felt colder now, as though the air itself had turned to stone. Elena stood in the dim glow of her flashlight. The files spread out before her like ghosts, whispering in a language only she could understand. Her hands shook as she reached for the satellite phone, the metal cold against her palm. For a moment, she hesitated. Once she made the call, there would be no turning back, but there was no one else left to trust. She powered it on. The faint hum of the signal filled the silence, and she dialed the number scrawled in Blake's handwriting on the note she had found. It rang twice before a voice answered low and steady. "Carter." She drew in a breath. "My name is Elena Ward," she said, her voice raw from dust and fear. "I have something Thomas Blake died for. Files, video, everything. You need to see it. But they know I found it." There was a brief pause. Then the journalist's tone sharpened. "Where are you calling from? Widow's Hollow," she said. "But I won't be here long." "Send it now," he replied. She didn't need to be told twice. Her fingers flew over the keypad, attaching the data from the drive and the video file. The signal wavered, then locked. The screen flashed transmission sent. Relief came and went like a spark. She exhaled slowly. It's done. The connection went dead a second later, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. She turned off the phone, slipped it into her pack, and looked around the chamber. Everything felt still again, too still. Then Cooper stiffened. His ears twitched, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. She froze, listening. At first she thought it might be the shifting of the mine's old timbers, but then she heard it faint, deliberate. Footsteps. Slow, cautious echoing down the tunnel from the direction she had come. Not the careless shuffle of an animal or the random creak of rock. Someone was down there. Heart pounding, she killed the light, plunging the cavern into darkness. The sound of her heartbeat filled her ears. Cooper pressed against her leg, trembling with quiet tension. She crouched low, her eyes adjusting to the faint gray light filtering through cracks in the rock. The footsteps grew clearer, steady, and unhurried, like a predator closing in on its prey. Her hand moved instinctively to the side pocket of her pack, searching until her fingers closed around the cold, familiar shape of an old smoke grenade, one she had kept since her service days more out of habit than hope. She hadn't expected to use it again. "Easy," she whispered to Cooper. Her voice was barely a breath. She felt for the pin, the smooth metal ring cool against her fingertips. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then came a low voice distorted by distance. "She's here. Sector 3. Move in." Her breath caught. She could see the faintest flicker of light, a flashlight beam cutting through the dark, far down the corridor. There was no time to think. She pulled the pin. The grenade hissed softly in her hand, the sound strangely gentle against the growing chaos. She threw it toward the approaching light. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a blinding flare burst white smoke erupting in thick waves that filled the narrow tunnel. The air turned opaque, swallowing everything. Shouts echoed through the haze, orders muffled by confusion. "Move, go, go!" The ground trembled beneath her knees as she grabbed Cooper's collar. "Come on," she hissed, pulling him towards the opposite passage. They ran through the smoke, coughing eyes stinging. Behind them, gunfire erupted, the flashes like lightning in the fog. Splinters of rock flew past her head, one cutting a sharp line across her shoulder. Pain flared hot, but she didn't slow. The tunnel split ahead. She took the left path, stumbling over loose stones, her breath ragged. Cooper stayed close, his bark echoing once before being drowned by the roar of collapsing timbers. The smoke thickened the air, choking. She could feel the mine shifting around them, the old supports groaning under stress. Another explosion, deeper this time, shook the ground. A shaped charge from the pursuers had detonated down-tunnel panic, or a planned choke. Rocks rained from above. She ducked, covering her head as dust poured down like sand. "Keep moving," she gasped. The faint glow ahead grew brighter, a shimmer of natural light seeping through an exit she hadn't noticed before. She pushed forward, lungs burning, one hand pressed against her bleeding shoulder. The air grew colder, fresher. Behind her, the tunnel roared again, a deep, echoing thunder that swallowed the shouts of the men still trapped inside. Cooper barked once more, urging her onward. She could feel the heat from the detonated grenade. Now, even through the smoke, a rolling wave of pressure and sound. The tunnel collapsed behind them, rock and timber crashing shut. They burst into the open just as the ceiling gave way. Elena fell to her knees on the rocky ground outside, gasping for air, her face streaked with soot and blood. Cooper limped beside her, his fur gray with dust. She looked back at the mine entrance. A cloud of smoke and debris rose into the sky, twisting upward like the last breath of something ancient. The sound that followed was low and final, the rumble of stone sealing its secrets. She pressed a hand to her wound, feeling the warm pulse of blood through her sleeve, and stared at the ruins. The mine had taken back what it had been forced to give, closing its mouth over the dead and the living alike. For a long moment, she could hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees. Then slowly, she turned away. The drive was gone, but the truth had already escaped. The world was quiet again, and for once the quiet did not hurt. Elena knelt on the ridge as the wind swept across the valley, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and stone. Below her, the mouth of Widow's Hollow burned flames, flickering in the pre-dawn light, like the last embers of a dying secret. The fire painted the rocks gold before the mountains swallowed it whole. She pressed her good hand against the ground to steady herself, the earth still trembling softly beneath her fingers. Cooper stood beside her, his fur silvered by ash, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. She reached down and scratched behind his ear, whispering, "It's over now." The wind answered with a long sigh, weaving through the pines, until it sounded almost like a voice carried from somewhere far beyond. She closed her eyes. For the first time in years, the silence did not carry ghosts. It simply was. When she opened her eyes again, the horizon was turning pale. Morning crept across the mountains slow and gentle, brushing the world clean. She sat there for a long while, watching as the smoke thinned and the light grew stronger. Her shoulder ached, her body bruised, but inside something had shifted, something that had been locked away for too long. Days passed in a blur after that. She walked until her feet bled, following old trails that led her out of the ridge and down into the valley, where the world still turned as though nothing had happened. In a small-town diner off a quiet highway, she sat in a booth by the window, her hair tied back her clothes, plain, just another face among strangers. The television above the counter played the morning news. She wasn't watching at first, not until she heard the words that made her heart stop. Breaking news. Evelyn Redd, CEO of Aegis Tactical Solutions, has been taken into federal custody on charges of treason weapons trafficking and conspiracy against the United States government. Federal subpoenas followed Carter's publication within hours. By day 3, Redd was in custody pending indictment. The voice of the anchor was calm, professional, as images filled the screen, men in suits escorting a woman in handcuffs down marble steps, cameras flashing, reporters shouting her name. According to officials' leaked documents and video evidence revealed direct involvement in illegal arms sales to foreign entities, the investigation is ongoing. Elena stared at the screen, her reflection faint in the glass as if she were watching from another life. No one around her looked up from their coffee. To them, it was just another story, another headline in a world full of noise. But to her, it was everything. She let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Cooper lay at her feet, tail thumping softly against the floor, unaware of the world that had just shifted. She reached down to pat him, smiling faintly. "We did it," she whispered. She finished her coffee, left a few bills on the counter, and walked out into the sunlight. The town was quiet, the streets washed clean from last night's rain. She didn't look back as she headed towards the edge of the forest. The mountain called to her still, and she followed it home. Weeks later, the cabin stood again, not as it once was, but as something new. The walls were uneven, the roof patched from salvaged wood, but it was enough. The forest had forgiven her, or perhaps simply forgotten. She spent her days rebuilding her nights, listening to the sounds of the wind and the river below. Each dawn brought peace instead of fear. Cooper would rest by the porch, his head on his paws, while she worked quietly mending what could be mended. One morning, as the mist rolled low across the valley, she stepped outside to find something waiting in the mailbox. A plain yellow envelope, edges worn, no return address. Her name wasn't written on it, but she knew somehow it was meant for her. She carried it inside, sat at the table, and opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice. No return address. Carter must have forwarded a note Blake had left with him for this day. The handwriting was neat, familiar, achingly familiar. "You found it. Thank you for bringing us home. T. Blake." Her hands trembled as she traced the letters, hearing his calm voice again in the echo of engines long gone. She set the note on the table beside the old photo she'd salvaged from the wreck, Blake smiling beside his Apache Sunlight gleaming off the fuselage. Cooper barked softly from the porch, tail wagging. She turned toward the window where morning light spilled through the trees, painting the air in gold. Her throat tightened, but the tears that came were quiet, gentle. She whispered, "You can rest now, Tom." Her voice caught, but then she smiled. "As for me, I think it is time I learned how to live again." Outside, the mist was lifting the valley, opening beneath the first true light of day. She stepped onto the porch, the wood warm beneath her feet, and breathed deeply. The forest answered with the whisper of leaves, the song of a new beginning. Somewhere far above, the wind carried the faint echo of rotors, turning not of war, but of memory. She stood still, hand over her heart, as Cooper nudged her leg, his eyes bright with trust. The fire of truth had taken so much, but it had left her something greater, the courage to keep going. And as the sun climbed over the ridge, Elena Ward smiled into the light, knowing that the silence she once feared had become her peace at last. If this story touched you, tell me which moment stayed with you most. Was it the wreck in the woods, or Blake's final message? Let me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that stay with you long after they end.